Hari Om. My name is Nishant Mishra, and I'm a faculty neurologist at a university in the United States. And today I'm going to talk about from Sanskrit narrative to scientific hypothesis. And I'll use a Bhīṣma Bhīṣma, a very important character in Mahābhārata, as a longitudinal case study in neuroscience, medicine, and medical humanities. Everything that I'm expressing in this talk is my own personal opinion. And please forgive me if I commit any error. Please do reach out to me to teach me about any error that I may be committing, either scientifically or from the religious, spiritual standpoint, because that is not my intention. My intention is just to generate some knowledge and also encourage particularly the Sanskrit colleagues, the Sanskritologists, Sanskrit Vidwans, to participate in interdisciplinary science and work with us together so that we can move the field forward and, more importantly, generate some useful knowledge for the future generation. So in short, human societies preserved detailed observations of learning, identity, suffering, aging, wisdom, and death through narrative long before these phenomena became objects of experimental science. Classical Sanskrit literature remains underrepresented in medical humanities and neuroscience, while attempts to connect ancient texts with modern science often alternate between dismissal and anachronistic claims of scientific anticipation. This work proposes a reproducible method for using classical narrative to generate scientifically meaningful questions while preserving philological and historical discipline. Bhīṣma, whose life in Mahābhārata extends from the education and succession through public renunciation, leadership, catastrophic injury, teaching, and death, is examined as a longitudinal literary case. The analytical sequence proceeds from primary Sanskrit text to philology, historical context, neutral behavioral observation, contemporary scientific comparison, and testable hypothesis. Three developmental phases organize the analysis. Formation raises questions concerning expertise, mentorship, oral learning, professional identity, and cognitive reserve. Commitment examines how a public vow becomes an organizing identity, supporting persistence while potentially constraining adaptive flexibility. Fulfillment explores personhood after catastrophic injury, pain and meaning, treatment preference, successful aging, sacred recitation, generativity, and end-of-life completion. 5 Sanskrit passages from the arrow-bed sequence are integrated with transliteration, literal and scholarly translation, and explicit verification status. Education and vow passages remain paraphrased pending some audit, which I have done using the Gita Press textbook. This work argues that classical Sanskrit narrative is neither biomedical evidence nor a substitute for experiment. Its scholarly value lies in preserving complex observations that may expand the range of questions modern science and medicine are prepared to ask. And that's the goal. Hari Om. So let's get started. So observation comes before experiment. Human beings have observed cognition, illness, suffering, moral conflict, resilience, aging, and death for millennia. Modern science transformed these observations by subjecting them to measurement, comparison, and experiment. Yet scientific questions rarely emerge from methods alone. They arise because a phenomena has first been noticed, an unusual pattern of learning, an enduring commitment, an unexpected recovery, a preserved capacity despite disability, or a form of suffering not adequately captured by existing categories. Literature is one of humanity's oldest technologies for preserving such observations. It records not only events, but also continuity across time. how childhood formation shapes adult identity, how one decision reorganizes later choices, how bodily decline alters social authority, and how meaning changes the experience of suffering. These observations do not establish mechanism or causality. They nevertheless make phenomena visible, and visibility is necessary precursor to hypothesis. The medical humanities and narrative medicine have demonstrated that illness cannot be understood solely through anatomy, physiology, and population level evidence. Patients experience disease through language, memory, identity, family, culture, expectation, and hope. Clinical judgment similarly requires more than technical knowledge. It requires attention to ambiguity, biography, values, and the meaning of possible outcomes. Yet, the literary traditions most frequently used in this scholarship remain disproportionately modern and Euro-American. The literary traditions most frequently used in this scholarship remain disproportionately modern and Euro-American. The Mahābhārata offers a major but still underused resource for such inquiry. Its narratives examine education, kinship, statecraft, moral responsibility, psychological conflict, violence, disability, grief, aging, and death over multiple generations. The Mahābhārata should not be treated as a concealed textbook of neuroscience or medicine, nor should it be excluded from scientific conversation merely because it is literary and some believe it is theological. Actually, many believe that it is theological. A more productive approach asks whether rigorous reading can identify observations from which contemporary research questions may emerge. Bhīṣma is uniquely suited to demonstrate this approach. His narrative extends across almost the full human lifespan. Childhood formation, extensive education, installation as a heir, public renunciation, institutional stewardship, moral conflict, military command, catastrophic injury, prolonged teaching despite injury, sacred recitation, and death. Few literary figures offer comparable longitudinal continuity. For a neurologist and a physician scientist, this continuity creates an opportunity to examine cognition, identity, agency, resilience, disability, aging, wisdom, and meaning within one coherent life narrative. So the central claim of this work, which I'm presenting today, is intentionally precise. Careful philological reading of Bhīṣma's life can generate scientifically meaningful and empirically testable questions while preserving the distinction between literary observation and biomedical evidence. The contribution is therefore methodological as well as interpretive, a disciplined pathway from text to question rather than from text to proof. The specific scholarly gap addressed here is methodological. Narrative medicine has established the clinical importance of attentive reading, biography, and narrative competence, while medical humanities scholarship has shown how literature can deepen ethical reflection and recognition of lived experience. Cognitive science and medical education, meanwhile, provide increasingly precise constructs for studying learning, identity, decision-making, aging, and adaptation. What remains insufficiently specified is a reproducible pathway by which a classical narrative may generate empirical questions without being misrepresented as biomedical evidence or mined selectively for apparent scientific anticipation. The present work proposes such a pathway and applies it to Bhīṣma as a proof of concept longitudinal literary case. The framework is designed to be auditable. Each proposed comparison should permit a reader to reconstruct the chain from a defined primary passage through philological and historical interpretation to a textually grounded behavioral description, an independently supported modern construct, and a falsifiable research question. Its novelty therefore lies less in asserting that literature and medicine can converse, a well-established position, than in specifying the evidentiary boundaries, sequence, and failure points of that conversation. So why Bhīṣma? The Mahābhārata contains many figures suited to interdisciplinary study. Arjuna foregrounds acute moral conflict and performance under pressure. Karna raises questions of belonging, stigma, and loyalty. Vidur embodies counsel and ethical governance. Draupadi confronts trauma, dignity, power, and justice. Bhīṣma is selected not because he's the only scientifically interesting character, but because his narrative is unusually longitudinal. That's the reason why we select him. His life links developmental stages that modern research commonly separates. Education precedes public responsibility. A vow reorganizes identity and constrains later options. Institutional loyalty interacts with moral conflict. Physical power eventually gives way to disability, yet intellectual and social contribution continue. The final period of life becomes not merely a narrative of dying, but a site of teaching, memory, legacy, and culturally meaningful completion. This continuity makes Bhīṣma an illustrative case rather than representative participant. He cannot be treated as a historical research subject, and extraordinary narrative elements cannot be converted into clinical data. His usefulness lies in the narrative connections the epic preserves. A longitudinal life story can expose interactions among formation, identity, institutions, injury, aging, and death that discipline-specific research may overlook. This work that I'm presenting today, therefore, organizes Bhīṣma's life into three phases: formation, commitment, and fulfillment. These terms are analytical rather than canonical. Formation asks how expertise, judgment, and professional identity are cultivated. Commitment asks how a public decision becomes an organizing self-narrative and how persistence relates to flexibility. Fulfillment asks what remains when physical power declines, but communication, teaching, meaning, and social contribution endure. So how should we read Bhīṣma? This work uses a sequential interpretive framework designed to keep textual, historical, behavioral, and scientific claims distinct. That's the goal. We used a sequential interpretive framework designed to keep the textual, historical, behavioral, and scientific claims distinct. The controlling practice source is the Gita Press Sanskrit Hindi Mahābhārata text used in this project's archive, where a Sanskrit passage has been directly recorded and audited in the existing source book. It is reproduced with transliteration and translation. Where only the chapter or narrative episode has been established, the manuscript paraphrases the episode and marks the verse level referencing, which I have conducted where needed. No Sanskrit is supplied merely because it is expected to exist in this process. The first stage is primary text identification. The first step is the primary text identification. The relevant passage is located within its parva, adhyaya, and narrative sequence. The second stage is philological interpretation. Key terms are examined within their Sanskrit semantic range rather than equated automatically with modern technical vocabulary. The third stage is historical and literary contextualization, including royal succession, pedagogical relationships, warrior ethics, ritual time, and the authority of elders. The fourth stage extracts a neutral behavioral observation. Examples include prolonged multi-domain education preceding the public authority, a witnessed commitment reorganizing identity, an injured person identifying discomfort and judging care, specialized physicians offering intervention, and dying being oriented toward culturally meaningful future event. This neutral observation creates a bridge between narrative and modern scholarship without presupposing mechanism. The fifth stage introduces contemporary constructs from neuroscience, psychology, medicine, education, leadership, gerontology, palliative care, and medical humanities. These constructs derive their authority from modern evidence, not from the epic. Resemblance is heuristic rather than confirmatory. The sixth stage formulates a research question or hypothesis clearly enough to be tested, and if unsupported, rejected. The evidentiary sequence is therefore one way: text, interpretation, observation, comparison, hypothesis. Scientific concepts are not used to manufacture the textual observation retrospectively. Conversely, textual authority is not used to validate a scientific claim. This framework treats interpretive transparency as analogous to methodological transparency in empirical research. A proposed narrative to science link should identify the controlling addition and locator, the textual wording or a clearly labeled paraphrase, the semantic and historical constraints on interpretation, the behavioral phenomena described without mechanistic presupposition, contemporary construct and the evidence supporting it, and a question whose terms can be operationalized. These elements make disagreement productive. A philologist may challenge the reading, a historian the context, the scientist the construct, and a methodologist the testability of the hypothesis without requiring rejection of the entire interdisciplinary enterprise. Three safeguards are especially important. First, analogy must not be mistaken for equivalence. Pratijñā, the promise, the vow, is not executive control. Dharma, the righteousness, is not a laboratory moral dilemma. And anurupa is not simply patient-centered care. Second, narrative salience must not be mistaken for prevalence or causality. Third, an attractive hypothesis must remain defensible. It must remain defensible. The framework succeeds when it produces a clearer empirical question, even if subsequent research refutes the proposed association. Formation. So let's talk about the formation, making of an expert mind. Making of an expert mind. So without going so much into detail, but to help contextualize, particularly those who are not familiar with the story, or this segment of the story, is that Ganga and Shantanu, they meet and they make kids. First few of them are taken away, to simplify, taken away by Ganga. The last son, she takes him, and then there comes a stage when she brings him back. The first few children, they needed to be, there's some story around why she needed to take them and give them away in the river Ganges or Ganga, as we say. I don't want to go into that detail, into that aspect. But what is interesting is that when Shantanu sees his son, it's very beautifully described in Mahābhārata. Sa kadachin mragam vidva ganga manu saranam nadim bhagirathi malpa jalam Shantanur drishtavan rupaha tam drishtva chintayama Shantanu purusharshabha swandate kim tuyam nadyam sarikshreshtha yathapura tato nimittam anvichanna dadarshasa mahamana kumaram rupa sampannam brahantam charu darshanam divyamastram vikurvana yada devam purandaram krishnam gangam samavritya saristikshane ravasthitam. So he sees his son around the river with all the beautiful adjectives linked to him. And then he sees that the son is so, it doesn't first recognize him. But he sees that the son has, this young man has slowed down the flow of the river Ganga through his skill sets. Tam sarerachitam drishtva nadim gangam tadantike abhavad vismito raja drishtva karmati manusham jatamatram pura drishtva tam putram shanturastada nipalebhe smritim dhiman abhigyatum tamatmajam satu tam pitaram drishtva mohaya masamaya samohyatu tatah kshipram tatraivantar dhiyata. And then when the child sees his father, he gets emotional, and then comes Ganga into the picture. He goes to Ganga to ask about this young man because he had a little doubt. He was going to meet him in his early adulthood at this moment when the story is ongoing. So it says, Tada bhuktam tato drishtva tatra raja sashantanuhu shankamanaha. He is doubtful. Shankamana sutam gangama bravi darshayati haha. And then he doubtfully asks Ganga, ki, show me my son. Darshayamasa tam Ganga bibhrati rupamuttamam grihitva dakshine panau tam kumara lamankritam. So Ganga ji is coming, well dressed, holding the son, and the son's name is Devavrat, who is later known as Bhīṣma, but here he is known as Devavrat. Alam krita bha bharanera virjambara samvratam dushtapurvam api sa tam nabhyajanat shantanuhu. Then the Ganga says, Gango Vacha, 33rd shlok. Yam putra mashtamam rajam stam pura maya vindatha sachayam purusha vyagra sarvastra vidunuttamam. She's now telling about all the virtues that she has imparted upon her son through the education. He's the best of the best as a warrior, for example. Grahanemam Maharaja Maya Sambardhitam Sutam Adaya Purusha Vyagra Naya Swainam Gruham Vibho Vedan Dhi Jage Sangan Vasishtha Deva Viryavan Vasishtha Desha Viryavan Krutastraha Parameshwaso Devaraja Samoyudhi. He has got the knowledge of all the Vedas from one of the top Maharshi or the professor of that time, Vasishtha. And he knows all the fighting skill sets as good as Devraj Indra. Suranam sammato nityam asuranam cha bharata ushana veda yachastra mayam tad veda sarvashah. So when she's introducing the son, she's actually talking about how she has offered education to him. Devavrat, Bhīṣma Pitama, he got the best of the best education growing up. He learned the Vedas and the Vedic education of those times, which has a lot of meaningful cognitive neuroscience related examples that I would talk later on in my effort on I.V. Pandit. So he became the Pandit. He became the Pandit of warship. He's a great archer. He can fight. He's as strong as he's as good as Indra in the fights in the wars. And Devta and Asur both offer him respect. He knows all the Niti Shastra, which Shukracharya has taught. Suranam sammato nityam asuranam cha bharata ushna veda yakshastra mayam tad veda sarvashaha tathaivangi rasaha putra surasura namaskృతః yad veda shastram tachapi krishna masmin pratishthitam tava putre mahabahau Sangopangam Mahatmani Rishihi Pareira Nadhrishyo Jamadagniha Pratapavan Yadastram Vedaramascha Tadetasmin Pratishthitam Maheshvasa Mimam Rajan Rajadharmartha Kovidam Mayadaktam Nijam Putram Viram Vira Gruham Naya. So she's telling him that he knows everything about the Rajdharma, how to rule the country, or Arthashastra, the economics. So she has given, the mother Ganga has given the best of the best education to him, and then his offering him to her husband, Shantanu, so that he goes there and rules the country in a very righteous fashion. So the education and capability are the virtues that leads to getting the position that makes him the capable, the rightful person to get the position to lead the country that his father was leading. And then it talks about, before we read these stanzas, it talks about how his father was leading the country. It talks about how in the righteous manner, best of the best manner, he was ruling his own country, his people, where nobody spoke lie. Everyone had everything, best of the best social architecture, which is a role model for us. But let's not get into that. We have to stay focused in our scientific inquiry. This will be a topic of another discussion at another point. But I just wanted to introduce the relevant text from the Mahābhārata. I wanted to just introduce those relevant texts. So let's talk about the making of expert mind. Modern neuroscience and educational psychology investigate how attention, memory, practice, feedback, motivation, and social context shape expertise. The scientific constructs are modern, but the practical questions are ancient. Why do some individuals achieve broad mastery? How do teachers shape judgment rather than merely transmit information? What distinguishes technical competence from wisdom? The phase A, the audit, locates Ganga's return of educated Deva Vrata and his installation as here in the, as described in the chapter that I just read from the Gita Press, Adi Parva, chapter 100. The exact shloka range I have already read about. The ordering is conceptually significant. The narrative depicts public authority as preceded by prolonged formation across scriptural, political, ethical, and martial domains. Devavrata is not introduced as an untrained prodigy. He's not untrained, whose legitimacy rests solely on birth. He is not offered the position or the opportunity just because he's the son. That's not the reason. He's not offered this opportunity just because he's the son of the king. He has studied all the Vedas thoroughly under the guidance of Maharshi Vashishta. He's well versed in the Vedanga and all the branches of knowledge. He's a great archer, equal to Indra in the battle. He has learned all divine weapons from Bhagavan Parashuram. He is expert in Rajadharma, Dandaniti, and the science of states. He is respected by the gods and the Asuras alike. He knows the teachings of Brihaspati and Shukra. He is fully prepared to discharge the duties of a Kshatriya and protect the Kuru kingdom. He's so well educated. So the father says, "Oh Ganga, you have raised an extraordinary son. Truly, he is worthy of the Kuru throne, his kingdom, and I accept him with great joy." That's the context. That's the context we are seeing here. That's the context we are seeing here. So this ordering is conceptually significant. Devavrata is not introduced as an untrained prodigy whose legitimacy rests solely on the birth. Education precedes succession. Ganga, the mother of Bhīṣma and Shantanu's wife, she recounts this in chapter 100, shlokas 32 to 39 of Adi Parva, Sambhav Parva. The comprehensive education and training the son, the Bhīṣma, the Devavrata, received from distinguished experts in the respective disciplines and across all facets of learning. So the mastery is relational, developed through teachers, discipline, and recognized preparation. The neutral behavior observation is that epic associates later authority with extended multi-domain formation. And the contemporary research distinguishes accumulated experience from adaptive expertise. Repetition may increase familiarity without producing flexible judgment. High-level performance is more often associated with structured challenge, feedback, correction, retrieval, and the ability to transfer knowledge to unfamiliar problems. So the Bhīṣma life provides us some rich observation about education, identity, commitment, trauma, resilience, aging, wisdom, and conscious death. And these observations can generate some testable hypotheses across multiple scientific domains. That can be done. So I was talking about the contemporary research distinguishes accumulated experience from adaptive expertise. Repetition may increase familiarity without producing flexible judgment. High-level performance is more often associated with structured challenge, feedback, correction, retrieval, and the ability to transfer knowledge to unfamiliar problems. And medical education likewise recognizes that competence involves more than factual recall. The medical education likewise recognizes that competence involves more than factual recall. It includes tolerance for uncertainty, contextual judgment, communication, ethical reasoning, and professional identity. The distinction between routine and adaptive expertise is particularly relevant here. It is very, very relevant here. So as I was telling previously, that the distinction between routine and adaptive expertise is particularly relevant here. Expertise is not merely the accumulation of time or information. It includes efficient pattern recognition with familiar conditions and the capacity to reorganize knowledge when circumstances changes. Studies of deliberate practice, retrieval, feedback, and transfer support the importance of structured learning, but the magnitude and generalizability of the practice effects may vary by domain. In medicine, adaptive expertise has therefore been framed as balancing efficiency with innovation rather than treating mastery as rigid repetition. Mentorship also contributes to more than skill acquisition. Role modeling, participation in communities of practice, progressive responsibility, and reflective dialogue help shape professional identity. These mechanisms make formation phase relevant to contemporary medical education while still leaving open the empirical question of which features of mentorship produce durable judgment, ethical agency, and the capacity to revise established routines. Bhīṣma's later movement from learner to teacher completes the educational arc. His accumulated knowledge becomes socially consequential through transmission. This raises questions about mentorship, generativity, and later life intellectual engagement. It does not establish that the education produced cognitive reserve or that Vedic training has demonstrated neuroprotective effect. It does make visible a research program examining whether long-term learning, multilingual scholarship, oral retrieval, teaching, and social purpose relate to cognitive resilience across the lifespan. So what are the questions? What questions do we get from this? So what questions can we ask? Questions generated by formation. Which combination of breadth, repeated retrieval, mentorship, and progressive responsibility best predict adaptive expertise? Does mentorship that includes ethical and institutional modeling shape professional identity differently from technical supervision alone? How do oral, multilingual, and retrieval intensive educational traditions, Avadhan, for example, affect attention, semantic memory, and long-term retention? Does continued teaching in later professional life relate to purpose, well-being, or cognitive resilience? Can medical education cultivate wisdom and judgment intentionally rather than treating them as incidental products of seniority? Some decisions alter a circumstance. Others reorganize an identity. Deva Vrata's renunciation of succession and adoption of lifelong celibacy, which is described in slokas 90 to 100 in chapter 100 of Adi Parva, resolved the immediate dynastic problem and determined the structure of his later life. So previously in this lecture, I was telling you the story about how Ganga offers Bhīṣma or Devavrat to his father, Shantanu, and then she leaves. And he is so virtuous, he's expected to be the king of, or the next king, or the prince of the kingdom. But then the story takes a turn. Shantanu, Bhīṣma's father, Devavrat's father, he gets infatuated by a woman and he goes asking for her to be married to him, to her father, who is Nishadraj, a fisherman. He sets up certain conditions. He says that the children born to his daughter should become the next prince and the king. And Bhīṣma agrees to that. But then the Nishad Raj is worried that what if Bhīṣma's own son or want to be the next king, and there is a conflict around it. And Bhīṣma promises that he will adopt brahmacharya. He will never marry, never procreate, never have a wife, never have kids. His life, all his life. And he does that for the sake of his father. So I'm going to read out those passages from Mahābhārata. So it starts from the 40th shloka. Initially, Vaishampayan Rishi is narrating the story. So this is how it goes. Ityuktva sa mahabhaga tatraivantaradhiyata tayevam samanugyataha putramadaya shantanu bhrajamanam yathaditya mayayau swapuram prati pauravastum purim gatva purandara puropamam सर्वकाम समृद्धार्थम मेनेशो आत्मनात्मना पौरवेशु ततः पुत्रम राज्यार्थमभयप्रदम गुणवन्तं महात्मानं यौवराजेभिषेचयत् पौरवाञ्छान्तनो पुत्रः पितरं च महायशाः राष्ट्रं च रञ्जयामास वृक्तेन भरतर्षभा स तथा सह पुत्रेण रममाणो महीपतिः वर्तयामास वर्षाणि चत्वार्यामित विक्रमः स कदाचित् वनं यातो यमुनामभितो नदीम्. So Ganga leaves, Shantanu starts running his country, and then one day he reaches next to the Yamuna river. It's in the north of India. And what does he find? Mahipatira nirdesha majighradha gandhamuttamam. It's very smelling so nice. Tasya prabhavam vikshan vichachara samantataha. Sadadarsha tada kanyam. Now he's seeing a girl there. Dashanam deva rupinim tama prachat sadashtvaiva kanyam asitalochanam. So he's found this woman, a girl, very beautiful. And he then asks her, Kasya tvamasi, kachasi kimcha, bhiruchi kershasi, sabravit dasa kanyasmi, dharmartham bahayetarim, piturni yogad bhadram te, dasaragyo mahatmanah, rupamadhurya gandhaistam, samyuktam deva rupinim, samiksha raja dasayim, kamayamasa santanu, sagatva pitaram tasya varayamasa tam tada. So he's asking, like, who are you? And she introduces herself as the daughter of the Nishad. And he is so much infatuated by her. So he goes and asks for daughter. He wants to marry her. So he goes and asks the Nishad. And he asks for her, that he wants to marry her. Paryapukchat tatastasyaha pitaram sotma karanat sachatam pratyuvachedam dasarajo mahipatim jatamatraiva medeya varaya varavarnini hrudi kamastu me kanchit tam nibodha janeshwaraha yadi mam dharma patnim tvam maktah prarthayase nagha Satyavagasi satyena samayam kurume tataha samayena pradadyam te kanyama mahimam nrupam nahi me tvat samaha kaschet varo jatu bhavishyati. She's asking for, he's setting up a condition. He's setting up a condition that in order to get my daughter married to you, you have to fulfill this X requirement. Shantanu uvacha. So King Shantanu is saying, Shrutva tava varam dasa vivasyeya maham tava datavyam cheta pradasyami datavyam cheta pradasyami natvadeyam katham chana. So he says that let me listen to what you want. If it is something that I can give you, I'll give you. But if it's not something that I should be giving you, I will not give you. So he's being very smart, which is good. So Dasha, he says, the Nishad Raj, he says, अस्याम जायत यह पुत्रः स राजा पृथ्वीपते त्वद्धूर्ध्वाभिषेक्तव्यो नान्यः कश्चन पार्थिव. Hey Lord of the planet Earth, the child born to this girl, he should become the next prince and the king, nobody else. So now Vaishampayan Rishi is narrating the story. Nakamayata tamdatum varam dasaya shantanuhu sarira jena tivrena dahyamanopi bharata. So he was, on the one hand, he was burning from desire, but he did not want to give this promise to the Nishad. Sachintayenneva tadadasha kanyam mahipatihi pratyayadhastinapuram kamopahat tachetanaha. And with all this disturbed mind, but not wanting to agree to the terms and conditions set out by the father, he returns back to Hastinapur, the kingdom where he used to rule his country from, or his people from. Tata kadache chokchantam shantanum dhyanamastitam putro deva vratobhetya pitaram vakyam abravit. Sarvato bhavatah kshemam vidheya sarva parthiva tata kimartham bhikshanam परिशोचसी दुःखितः ध्यानीव च मां राजन्नभिभाससि किंचन न चाश्वेन विनिर्यासि विवीर्णो हरिणः कृशः व्याधमिच्छामि ते ज्ञातुं प्रतिकुर्याहि तत्र वै एवमुक्तः स पुत्रेण शान्तनु प्रत्यभासत असंशयं ध्यानपरो यथा वत्स तथा शृणु अपत्यं नस्तवां मे वै कः कुले महति भरत शस्त्र नित्यश्च सततं पौरुषसे पर्यवस्थितः अनित्यतां च लोकानामनुशोचामि पुत्रक कथं चित्तव गांगेय विपक्तौ नास्ति नः कुलम् असंशयं त्वमेवैकः शतादपि वरः सुतः न चाप्यहं वृथा भूयो दारान् कर्तुमिहोत्सहे सन्तानस्य विनाशाय कामये भद्रमस्तु ते अनापत्य तैकपुत्र त्ववि मित्याहुर्धर्मवादिनः चक्षुर्नाशे तनोर्नाशः पुत्रनाशे कुलक्षयः चक्षुरेकं च पुत्रश्च अस्ति नास्ति च भारत अग्निहोत्रं त्रयी विद्या सन्तानमपि चाक्षयं सर्वाण्येतान्यपत्यस्य कलां नार्हन्ति षोडशीम्. एवमेतन्मन्युष्येषु तच्च सर्वप्रजास्विति यदपत्यं महाप्राज्ञ तत्र मे नास्ति संशयः एषा त्रयी पुराणानां देवतानां च शाश्वती अपत्यं कर्म विद्या च त्रीणि ज्योतिंषि भारत यदिदं कारणं तात सर्वमाख्यातमञ्जसा त्वं च शूर सदामर्षि शस्त्रनित्यश्च भारत नान्यत्र युद्धात् तस्मात् ते निधनं विद्यते क्वचित् सोऽस्मि संशयमापन्नस्त्वयि क्षान्ते कथं भवेत् इति ते कारणं तात दुःखस्योक्ता मशेषतः. So essentially the son asks the father, why are you worried? And he says a lot of other things about virtue and stuff. But essentially it boils down to sharing the feeling about this woman who he loves but cannot marry because the father has set out some conditions. So then what does the son do? So Vaishampayan Rishi is telling, what did he do? He did tatastha karanam ragyo gyatva sarvam sheshatah. Vaishampayan Rishi is describing devavrato mahabuddhi pragyaya chanva chintayat abhyagacchata tadevashu bruddhamatyam piturhitam tamapruchat tadabhyetya pitustakchoka karanam tasmai sa kuru mukhyaya yathavat pariprakshate varam shasamsh कन्याम तामुत दिश्या भरतर्षभ सूतं भूयोपि संतप्त आह्वयामास वै पितुः सूतस्तु कुरु मुख्यस्य उपयातस्तदाज्ञया तमुवाच महाप्राज्ञो भीष्मो वै सारथिं पितुः. Then Bhīṣma, he goes to the charioteer and asks him that take me to the place where the woman was. Tvam sarathe pitur bahyam sakhasi रथयुग यतः अपि जानासि यदि वै कस्यां भावो नृपस्यतु यथा वक्षसि मे पृष्टः करिष्ये न तदन्यथा. So then the charioteer Sut says, दाशकन्या नरश्रेष्ठ तत्र भावा पितर्गतः वृता सा नरदेवेन तदा वाच नमब्रवीत् योऽस्यां पुमान् भवेद् गर्भ स राजा तदन्तरं नाकामयत तं दातुं पिता तौ वरं तदा स चापि निश्चयस्तस्य न च दद्यामतोऽन्यथा एवं ते कथितं वीरा कुरुष्व यदनन्तरम्. So he tells him about the daughter of Dhivar and how he asked, and then the reason why he didn't agree, because he was wanting that the child, the son born to the girl, would be the one who should be the next king. And his father, Shantanu, was not willing to do this. ततो देवाव्रतो वृद्धैः क्षत्रियैः सहितस्तदा अभिगम्य दासराजं कन्यां वव्रे पितुः स्वयं तं दासा प्रति जग्राह विधिवत् प्रतिपूज्य च अब्रवीच्चैनमासीनं राजसंसदि भारत. Dasha Uvaj, then he's telling, the Dasharaj is telling, the Nishad Raj is telling, Rajashulka pradatavya kanyeyam yajatamvara apatyam yad bhave tasyaha sa rajastu pitu param tvameva natha paryaptah santanor bharatarshabha putra shastra bhratam shrestha kim tu vakshami te vachah ko hi sambandhakam slaghya mipsitam yaunamidrisham ati kamanna tapyeta sakshadapi shatakratu अपत्यम चैतदार्यस्य यो युष्माकं समो गुणै यस्य शुक्रात् सत्यवती संभूतावर वर्णिनी तेन मे बहुशस्तास्ता पिता ते परिकीर्तितः अर्हः सत्यवतीं बोढुं धर्मज्ञः स नराधिप अर्थितश्चापि राजर्षिः प्रत्याख्यातः पुरा मया स चप्यासीत् सत्यवत्या वृषमर्ति महायशा कन्या पितृत्वात् किंचित् तु वक्ष्यामि त्वां नराधिप बलवत्सा पत्नतामात्र दोषं पश्यामि केवलं यस्य हि त्वं सपत्नः स्या गन्धर्वस्यासुरस्य वा न स जातु चिरं जीवे त्वयि क्रुद्धे परन्तप एतावानत्र दोषो हि नान्यः कश्चन पार्थिव एतज्जानीहि भद्रं ते दानादाने परन्तप. So then essentially he asks about the conditions, and then he says that whoever is born, he agrees, he promises that whoever is born to your daughter Satyavati will be the next king, not me. Vaishampayan Rishi is telling, Eva muktastu gangeyastyuktam pratyabhasata srunuvatam bhumipalanam pitu rarthaya bharata idam me vratamadastva satyam satyavatamvara naiva jato na vajata idrusham vaktumutsahet evametat karishyami yatha tvam anubhasase yosyam janisyate putra sano raja bhavishyati. He says that the son born to your daughter would be the king. Ityukta punarevatha tamodasa pratyabhasata chikirshur dushkaram karma rajarthe bharatarshava tameva natha samprapta santanora mitudyate kanyayascheva dharmatman prabhurdan nayacheshwara. इदं तु वचनं सौम्यं कार्यं चैव निबोध मे कौमारीकाणां शीलेन वक्ष्याम्यहमरिन्दमम् यत् त्वया सत्यवत्यर्थे सत्यधर्मपरायण राजमध्ये प्रतिज्ञाता मनुरूपं तवैव तत् नान्यथा तन्महाबाहो संशयोऽत्र न कश्चन तवापत्या भवेद्यत्तु तत्र न संशयो महान्. So then in this shloka 92, he says that all that is fine, but if you have a son and if your son is not agreeing to your promise, then there'll be problem. That's why I'm worried. So Vaishampayan Rishi further says, Tasyai tan matamagyaya satyadharma parayana pratyajanat tadarajan pito priyachikirshayam. And then what is he saying? So, understanding the point of Nishadraj, Bhīṣma or Gangeya or Devavrat, same name, same person, different names. He, in his love for his father, he goes ahead and takes even a stronger vow. He says, Dasaraja nibodhedam vachanam me narottamam ऋषयो वाथवा देवा भूतान्यंत हितानि च यानि यानि ह शृण्वन्तु नास्ति वक्ता हि मत्समः इदं वचनमादत्तस्व सत्येन मम जल्पतः शृण्वतां भूमिपालानां यद्ब्रवीमि पितुः कृते। नरश्रेष्ठ निषादराज, मेरी यह बात सुनो। जो जो ऋषि, is saying in Hindi, I'm translating it, that listen, hey Nishadraj, hey the king of Nishadas, listen, जो जो ऋषि देवता और अंतरिक्ष के प्राणी यहाँ हैं, all those rishis, gods, devatas, all the other organisms, birds are there, let them all listen to me. मेरे समान वचन देने वाला दूसरा नहीं है. There is nobody like me who can take a vow like the way I am taking. निषाद, मैं सत्य कहता हूं. हे निषाद, I am telling the truth. पिता के हित के लिए सब भूमिपाल के सुनते हुए मैं जो कुछ कहता हूं, मेरी इस बात को समझो. All those who are, all the kings around here, almost everyone who is around here, listen to me and understand me. And then he takes the vow. He says, Rajyam tavat purvameva maya tyaktam naradhipa apatya hetorapi cha karishedya vinischayam. I have already given up, abdicated the kingdom. Now I'm going to make another promise about having a child in the future. Adya prabhuti me dasha brahmacharyam bhavishyati aputrasyapi me loka bhavishyantyakshaya divi. He says, Oh Nishadraj, from today I am going to live the life of brahmacharya, never have a son, no sexual contact. I will be able to reach the Swarga even without having a son. And I have never said anything lie in my life since my birth. And as long as I have life in my body, I will never procreate. Now give your daughter to my father, and that's the biggest sacrifice he makes. Nahi janma prabhutyuktam mama kinchid hidan hrutam kinchid hina nrutam yavat prana dhriyante vai mama deham samasrita tavan janishyami pitre kanyam prayakshame परित्यज्याम वहम राजम मैथुनम चापि सर्वशः ऊर्ध्वरेदा भविष्यामि दास सत्यम ब्रवीमिते. So then he agrees to it. He agrees to this. And he makes this promise. So in the 103 shlok, he says, his father says, Nate mrityuh prabhavita yava jivitum ichchasi takto hyanugyam samprapya mrityu prabhavitanagha. So he gives him the boon of ichcha mrityu. And this is taken from the Mahābhārata Adi Parva. Within Adi Parva, there is Sambhav Parva. And that it is the 100th chapter. It is the chapter number 100. So I wanted to share the story so that listeners who don't know the full story, they're able to put in context. And if you are more interested, you can find the original version and read for yourself. Some decisions alter a circumstance. Other reorganize an identity. Devavrata's renunciation of succession and adoption of lifelong celibacy, which I just described from shlokas 90 and so on of chapter 100 of Adi Parva, resolves an immediate dynastic problem while determining the structure of his later life. The public nature of the commitment is central here. Devavrat is no longer interpreted merely as a prince who made a difficult choice. He becomes Bhīṣma. The word Bhīṣma refers to the Bhīṣan, the terrific vow that he took. And the name itself preserves the collective recognition of the decision. The vow functions as an organizing self-narrative through which subsequent service, restraint, and loyalty acquire coherence. Contemporary psychology suggests that goals integrated into identity often produce a stronger persistence than externally imposed intentions. Let me repeat. Contemporary psychology suggests that goals integrated into identity often produce stronger persistence than externally imposed intentions. Externally imposed intentions. Imposed intentions. Public commitments may intensify this effect through reputation, social expectation, and the psychological cost of reversal. Cognitive neuroscience contributes constructs such as goal maintenance, inhibitory control, conflict monitoring, and behavioral flexibility, but none should be treated as translations of pratijñā or dharma. Modern identity-based motivation research proposes that behavior is influenced not only by the value of an immediate outcome, but by whether an action feels congruent with the active self. Goal maintenance and conflict monitoring provide complementary cognitive models for sustaining behavior and detecting competition among possible actions. These literatures support disciplined comparison with the narrative effects of Bhīṣma's vow, but they also sharpen the central caution. Persistence can be adaptive only when accompanied by the capacity to update goals in response to altered evidence, obligations, and consequences. The narrative preserves the double edge of commitment. The vow stabilizes Bhīṣma's identity and supports long-term institutional service. It also narrows his available responses when circumstances change. Persistence and flexibility are both necessary for adaptive behavior. Either can become harmful when detached from the context. And this tension has particular relevance to professional medicine, where integrity depends on durable commitments. But rigid identity may contribute to moral distress, burnout, delayed help-seeking, or reluctance to revise decisions. Bhīṣma's leadership similarly resists simple classification. His authority increasingly rests on continuity, counsel, and stewardship rather than sovereign power. Institutional loyalty preserves stability, but may also delay necessary challenge. The episode therefore offers a literary case through which leadership education can examine when fidelity becomes moral courage or courage and when it becomes a constraint. So what are the questions that are generated by commitment? How do witnessed public commitments become integrated into personal and professional identity? When does identity-based persistence improve integrity, and when does it impair adaptive revision? Can narrative-based education help clinicians distinguish steadfastness from rigidity? How do stewardship identities influence institutional continuity, dissent, and succession planning? And do morally elevating narratives affect professional aspiration, pro-social motivation, or ethical reflection? Hari Om. Let's continue further. The final phase of Bhīṣma's life is the most textually advanced portion of the present audit. Its clinical importance does not lie in reconstructing the physiology of prolonged survival after penetrating battlefield injury. The more durable observation is that bodily devastation does not erase the capacity to communicate discomfort, judge what is fitting, receive or decline care, teach, maintain relationships, and organize dying around culturally meaningful completion. The arrow bed transforms the narrative. So those who don't know, what happens is that Arjuna attacks on him. There's a specific context, how and when he's able to and why he's successful doing that. And I'll read out those sections for you in a little bit. But what Arjuna does is that the way he attacks, Bhīṣma essentially ends up getting a bed of arrows. The bed of arrows. That's what ends up happening. That's what ends up happening. Contemporary disability scholarship and rehabilitation can take some advantage from this example, from this incidence. The arrow bed transforms the narrative. Physical vulnerability becomes the setting in which the intellectual and social authority reach their greatest expression. In neurology, rehabilitation, geriatrics, and palliative care, this juxtaposition foregrounds an enduring clinical principle. Motor dependence and severe bodily impairment cannot serve as proxies for loss of personhood, decisional capacity, or meaningful contribution. As I was saying, contemporary disability scholarship and rehabilitation ethics caution against inferring cognition, quality of life, or decisional capacity from visible motor impairment. Capacity is decision specific and ordinarily concerns the abilities to understand relevant information, appreciate its significance, reason about alternatives, and communicate a choice. Communication barriers may obscure these abilities without eliminating them. The narrative cannot establish Bhīṣma's clinical capacity in the modern sense, but it usefully exposes the error of equating bodily dependence with the disappearance of agency or personhood. Expressing discomfort and requesting support. So there comes this shloka in chapter 120, shloka number 37, 38, and 41, where it says, seeing Arjuna approaching, the illustrious Bhīṣma, the foremost among men, spoke to the mighty son of Pandu, celebrated everywhere as a supreme warrior, saying, what does he say? O Arjuna, mighty armed hero, my head is unsupported and hangs downward. If you deem it appropriate, grant me a fitting pillow. Tato vikshya narasreshtam abhyapatata pandavam dhananjayam dirghabahum sarvaloka maharatham dhananjaya mahabaho shirome tvam lambate diyatamu padhanam ve yadyakta miha manyase. This is what happens. The ethically important action, however, is communication. Bhīṣma identifies specific source of discomfort and requests assistance. The narrative therefore begins care not with clinician's assumption, but with injured person's report. In contemporary practice, this invites attention to accessible communication, symptom elicitation, and the distinction between physical dependence and inability to express preference. Anurupa, care judged, fitting by the recipient. शयनस्यानुरूपं मे पाण्डवोपहितं त्वया यद्यन्यथा प्रपद्येथा सपेयं त्वामहं रुषा. What you have placed is appropriate for one lying in the state, O Pandava. Had you acted otherwise, I would have reproached you in anger. The key term here is anurupa, which can convey fittingness, correspondence, or appropriateness to person and circumstance. To person and circumstance. So in this shloka, ततो वीक्ष्य नरश्रेष्ठमभ्या पतत पांडवम धनंजयम दीर्घबाहुम सर्वलोका महारथम धनंजय महाबाहो शिरो मे त्वं लंबते दीयतामुपधानम वै यद्युक्तम इह मन्यसे. O Arjun, mighty armed hero, my head is unsupported and hangs downward. If you deem it appropriate, grant me a fitting pillow. The ethically important action is communication. Bhīṣma identifies a specific source of discomfort and requests assistance. The narrative therefore begins care not with clinician's assumption, but with injured person's report. The contemporary practice thus invites attention to accessible communication, symptom elicitation, and distinction between physical dependence and inability to express preference. Then, anurup, care judged fitting by the recipient. Shayanasyanurupam me pandavo pahitam tvaya yadyanyatha prapadyetha sapeyam tvamaham rusha. What you have placed is appropriate for one lying in the state, O Pandava. Had you acted otherwise, I would have reproached you in anger. This is said in Gita Press, chapter 120, Bhīṣma Parva. It talks about the arrow bed sequence. It is sloka number 48. So the key term anurupa can convey fittingness, correspondence, or appropriateness to person and circumstance. It should not be translated automatically as patient-centered care, a modern ethical construct. The passage nevertheless foregrounds congruence between an intervention and the recipient's identity, condition, and understanding of what is suitable. It therefore generates clinical question: how should comfort be negotiated when a patient's values produce preference that observers find unfamiliar? Then let's talk about specialized physicians and available intervention. Mahābhārata in Bhīṣma Parva, chapter 120, verses 55-59. In the Vulgate numbering, it reflects, it says, Upatishthannatho vedya salyodha dharanako vidah sarvopakarana-yukta kushalai sadhu sikshita tāna dashtva jahani putraha janvi putra Ganga putra provāchatanayam tava daktadeya prasajjanita dattadeya visrajyantam पूजयित्वा चिकित्सकाः एवं गदे महेर्दानि वैदेयैः कार्यमिहस्ति किम छत्रधर्मे प्रशस्तां हि प्राप्तोऽस्मि परमां गतिं नैष धर्मो महीपाला शरतल्पागत्स्य मे एभिरेव सरेश्चाहं दग्धव्यो नाग्नः नराधिपाः तच्छ्रुत्वा वचनं तस्य पुत्रो दुर्योधनस्तव वैद्यान् विसर्जयामास पूजयित्वा यथार्हतः. So Bhīṣma accepts Arjuna's arrow pillow and declares that he will stay on the arrow bed. Then the physicians skilled in extracting arrows approached. They were competent, well-trained, and had all the necessary instruments. Seeing them, Bhīṣma said, honor these physicians, pay them their due, and then dismiss them. Now that I have reached this state, what purpose can physicians serve for me here? I have achieved the highest goal in the dharma of warrior. O kings, treatment is no longer suitable for me as I lie on this bed of arrows. With these arrows still in my body, I should be burnt in the funeral fire. Hearing this, Duryodhana honored the physicians and dismissed them. It is said in third person because it's a story being told. So that's to the king, the father of Duryodhana, Dhritarashtra. So that's why it says, hearing this, your son Duryodhana honored the physicians and dismissed them. The passage recognizes specialized expertise, appropriate instruments, and the availability of intervention. If it does not establish equivalence with modern trauma surgery. Its narrative importance is that treatment is represented as available. Bhīṣma's later decision is therefore framed against the presence of skilled healers rather than the absence of care. But then what happens subsequently? He declines further intervention. Evam gatena hi idanim vaidye karyamihasti me chhatra dharma prasastam hi praptosmi paramam gatim. In this state, there is now no work for physicians concerning me here. I have reached the supreme course praised in dharma of warriors. What it means is, in my present condition, I have no further need for physicians. I have reached the final state honored within the warrior's moral world. It would be anachronistic to label this statement a modern advanced directive. Do not resuscitate order or hospice election. This will be anachronistic. The decision is embedded in warrior ethics, narrative destiny, and theology. Yet the passage foregrounds a problem familiar to contemporary medicine. The availability of an intervention does not by itself determine whether it accords with persons' values, goals, prognosis, and conception of good health. Modern shared decision-making similarly distinguishes the existence of a technically available treatment from a justified treatment decision. High-quality decisions require an account of options, expected benefits, and burden, uncertainty, the person's values and goals, and the clinical context. The treatment refusal is not automatically evidence of capacity, nor is it disagreement evidence of incapacity. It's neither this nor that. By keeping these distinctions explicit, the episode can enrich ethical reflection without being retrofitted into contemporary legal doctrine. Pashyadhva me Pandavena Bhisamhidam Shishyedyasyam Sayyayam Yavadavartat Namrave. Ye tada mam gamishyanti te cha prekshyanti mam nrupaah disham vishravana krantam yadaganta divakarah turnam saptahaya yuktena rathenathi manojasa vimoksheham tada pranan suhrudah supriyaniva. Behold the pillow that has been provided for me by the son of Pandu. Upon this bed I shall remain until the sun changes its course, goes into the stage of Uttarayan. Those kings who come to me when the sun reaches the northern direction, Uttarayan, the region associated with Kubera, will witness me then. When the swift sun, drawn by 7 horses, reaches that northern course, I shall willingly release my life breath, just as one parts from the beloved friends. The turning of the sun belongs to the epic's sacred cosmology and should not be reduced to chronobiology. In medical humanistic relevance lies in temporal orientation. People approaching death may orient endurance and decision-making toward the arrival of family, completion of ritual, reconciliation, teaching, an anniversary, or another meaningful event. These goals may be clinically important even when they do not alter disease biology. Palliative care research supports attention to spiritual well-being, dignity, family connection, unfinished responsibilities, and personally meaningful goals near the end of life. These domains cannot be reduced to symptom scores, yet they may influence treatment preferences. perceived quality of care, and the experience of dying. The comparison offered here concerns temporal and existential orientation, not a claim that sacred chronology has a biomedical mechanism. Bhīṣma's prolonged teaching after injury further complicates biomedical models centered on independence. The Shanti and Anusana discourses portray later life as a period of generativity and institutional transmission. The warrior becomes an elder teacher, and knowledge rather than physical power becomes the basis of authority. Contemporary gerontology similarly distinguishes physical function from purpose, social contribution, emotional regulation, and wisdom. The Vishnu Sahasranam episode adds the dimensions of organized memory, sacred recitation, legacy, and wonder. This present work does not infer intact neural networks from a literary recitation, nor does it claim a therapeutic effect of chanting on the basis of the epic. It identifies legitimate research questions concerning oral memory, rhythm, semantic organization, attention, spiritual practice, and the role of legacy near death. The final phase, therefore, reframes the meaning of fulfillment. Biological longevity is not the only outcome. Communication, teaching, contribution, dignity, and the culturally meaningful completion may remain central even after the cure and the physical restoration, even when the cure and physical restoration are unavailable. So what are the questions generated by fulfillment? How should clinicians assess agency when severe motor dependence coexists with preserved communication and purpose? How do identity, meaning, and social role influence suffering independently of nociceptive burden? What forms of later life teaching and generativity relate to the well-being or cognitive resilience? How do spiritual and culturally meaningful temporal goals influence treatment preference and quality of dying? So from Bhīṣma to a method for interdisciplinary scholarship. Let's talk about that. Talk about the methodology, which is I think, an important segment of this discussion. The preceding discussion follow one life through formation, commitment, and fulfillment. Their unity lies not in a scientific theory attributed to the Mahābhārata, but in a method. Textual observation is established before contemporary interpretation, and interpretation culminates in a question rather than a claim of proof. This approach avoids two symmetrical errors. Anachronism treats modern constructs as though ancient authors formulated them in contemporary terms. Dismissal treats literary observation as irrelevant because it is not experimental evidence. The proposed framework occupies a disciplined middle position. Literature identifies and preserves phenomena. Philology and history. Philology and history constrain interpretation. Modern science supplies constructs and methods. Empirical research determines whether a hypothesis survives. Bhīṣma's formation raises questions about breadth of learning, mentorship, oral retrieval, adaptive expertise, and later life teaching. Commitment reveals interaction of identity, public reputation, persistence, leadership, and flexibility. Fulfillment foregrounds agency after severe injury. Preference, sensitive care. pain and meaning, generativity, sacred time and dignity. Contemporary science often studies these topics separately. The longitudinal narrative situates them within a single biography and therefore encourages research into their interactions over time. For neurology, the manuscript For neurology, I'm going to work on a manuscript and send it out for publication. And this work, I think, directs attention beyond impairment. Clinical practice regularly encounters profound disability after stroke, trauma, neurodegeneration, neuromuscular disease, and chronic pain. Mechanism and prognosis remain essential, but they do not exhaust the clinical task. Identity, communication, agency, relationships, purpose, and contribution influence what recovery and care mean to an individual. For medical education, Bhīṣma provides a longitudinal case rather than an isolated dilemma. Learners may revisit early formation after seeing the later consequences of identity and commitment. They may examine how admired virtues become constraints, how disability coexists with authority, and how teaching itself becomes a form of legacy. These complexities are more instructive than a predetermined moral lesson. For medical humanities, the framework extends close reading toward hypothesis generation while retaining the irreducibility of meaning. Irreducibility of meaning. Neuroscience investigates mechanisms. Narrative preserves experience, ambiguity, and temporal continuity. Their collaboration is productive only when neither discipline is used to subsume the other. The methodological contribution can therefore be stated independently of the Bhīṣma's interpretation. The methodological contribution can therefore be stated independently of the Bhīṣma interpretation. The Sanskrit narrative to scientific hypothesis framework is a six-stage auditable process for converting a culturally situated literary observation into a researchable question while preserving disciplinary asymmetry. Textual scholarship determines what the narrative can responsibly be said to describe, Contemporary science determines the validity of modern constructs and methods, and neither domain supplies evidentiary authority for the other. Bhīṣma serves as the proof of concept rather than the limit of the method. The framework also establishes criteria by which future applications may be judged. A strong application should be textually locatable, philologically defensible, historically contextualized, behaviorally explicit, scientifically referenced, operationalizable, falsifiable, and ethically appropriate. Our weak application will typically fail by omitting source verification, collapsing Sanskrit concepts into modern terminology, selecting only confirmatory evidence, or presenting resemblance as discovery. These criteria allow the approach to be replicated, criticized, and improved across texts and disciplines. So what are the limitations? The Mahābhārata is a layered literary, philosophical, and theological work rather than a contemporaneous clinical record. Bhīṣma cannot be diagnosed retrospectively, and extraordinary narrative elements cannot be converted into physiological evidence. The modern constructs used in this work, expertise, cognitive reserve, executive control, professional identity, patient-centered care, successful aging, and dignity, are analytical lenses rather than translations of Sanskrit concepts. Similarity does not establish historical priority or conceptual equivalence. Translation remains interpretive. Terms such as dharma, pratijñā, brahmacharya, anurupa, jnana, buddhi, and prajna have semantic ranges that exceed the scope of the single English equivalent. This is another challenge, the difficulty with translating Sanskrit into English, because there are not exact words in English for the layered meanings, for the meanings of the words used in Sanskrit. Jal, pani, toy, they're all water, but they have different meaning, different context, preferred in different situations for use. Okay, selection bias, that is unavoidable. The manuscript foregrounds episodes that support the formation, commitment, fulfillment architecture. Other domains, including reproduction, yoga, genetics, public health, statecraft, gender, and additional theological material, are not treated comprehensively. The hypothesis remains untested. Their merit depends on feasibility, operational clarity, ethical design, replication, and the quality of future empirical work. But where do we go from here? Bhīṣma's life may be developed into a longitudinal educational case for physicians and trainees. Unlike a single ethical vignette, the case would permit learners to see how early education and public decisions shape later responsibilities, moral conflicts, aging, disability, and death. Educational benefit should be measured rather than assumed. The methodology is transferable but not universalizing. Comparative work may include other figures from Sanskrit, Buddhist, Jain, Greek, Chinese, Shakespearean, and other modern literary traditions. The goal would be to identify culturally specific observations and examine whether the modern medical categories require refinement when confronted with different accounts of autonomy, resilience, wisdom, and good death. The most credible research program will require collaboration among Sanskrit philologists, historians, clinicians, psychologists, neuroscientists, gerontologists, palliative care scholars, ethicists, and medical educators. Each discipline should both constrain and enrich the other. So let's conclude. Bhīṣma's life is remembered through education, renunciation, institutional service, war, catastrophic injury, teaching, sacred recitation, and chosen departure, Icchamrityu. Its relevance to medicine does not depend on reading these events as clinical history. It lies in the observations the narrative preserves. Formation foregrounds how learning, mentorship, and responsibility contribute to expertise and judgment. Commitment reveals how a public decision may organize identity across decades while creating both integrity and constraint. Fulfillment shows that bodily dependence may coexist with communication, agency, wisdom, spiritual meaning, and social contribution. These observations do not prove modern theories. They make important questions visible. The Sanskrit to science framework begins with the text, proceeds through philology and historical context, extracts a neural behavioral observation, introduces contemporary scholarship cautiously, and culminates in a testable hypothesis. Science investigates mechanisms, associations, and causality. Literature preserves experience, ambiguity, interiority, and the long consequences of human choices. Medicine requires both. It needs evidence to determine what works, and it needs narratives to recognize what matters. The Mahābhārata need not be treated as either a relic of the past or a substitute for experimentation. Read with philosophical discipline, historical humility, clinical attentiveness, and scientific openness. Bhīṣma's life can become a continuing partner in humanities' effort to understand learning, identity, suffering, aging, wisdom, death, and the conditions under which the human life acquires meaning. Human life acquires meaning. So I'll conclude by providing a short summary in Hindi, Sanskrit, and English. अंत में भीष्म का जीवन हमें केवल महाभारत के एक महान पात्र की कथा नहीं सुनाता, यह हमारे सामने एक संपूर्ण मानवीय जीवन रखता है, शिक्षा और व्यक्तित्व निर्माण से लेकर प्रतिज्ञा और उत्तरदायित्व तक। संघर्ष और विनाशकारी शारीरिक आघात से लेकर ज्ञान, गरिमा, आध्यात्म और मृत्यु की सचेत स्वीकृति तक। इस व्याख्यान में मैंने भीष्म के जीवन को 3 चरणों में समझने का प्रयास किया है: निर्माण, प्रतिबद्धता और परिपूर्णता। उनका निर्माण हमें शिक्षा, गुरु शिष्य परंपरा, बहुविषयी ज्ञान, अभ्यास, स्मृति और नेतृत्व के विकास पर विचार करने के लिए प्रेरित करता है। उनकी प्रतिबद्धता यह दिखाती है कि एक सार्वजनिक प्रतिज्ञा व्यक्ति की पहचान को स्थिरता, उद्देश्य और असाधारण धैर्य उद्देश्य दे सकती है, किंतु वही प्रतिज्ञा बदलती परिस्थितियों में उसकी अनुकूलनशीलता को सीमित भी कर सकती है। उनके जीवन का अंतिम चरण हमें बताता है कि गंभीर शारीरिक निर्भरता के बाद भी संवाद, निर्णय क्षमता, ज्ञान, सामाजिक योगदान, आध्यात्मिक अर्थ और मानवीय गरिमा सुरक्षित रह सकते हैं। किंतु उस पूरे अध्ययन का उद्देश्य यह सिद्ध करना नहीं है कि महाभारत आधुनिक तंत्रिका विज्ञान या चिकित्सा विज्ञान की पुस्तक है। साहित्यिक वैज्ञानिक प्रमाण का स्थान नहीं ले सकता। साहित्य वैज्ञानिक प्रमाण का स्थान नहीं ले सकता और आधुनिक वैज्ञानिक शब्दों को प्राचीन संस्कृत अवधारणाओं पर आरोपित नहीं किया जा सकता या किया जाना चाहिए। इसके बजाय मेरा प्रस्ताव एक अनुशासित संवाद का है। पहले मूल संस्कृत पाठ, फिर उसका भाषा शास्त्रीय और ऐतिहासिक विवेचन, उसके बाद तटस्थ होकर मानवीय अवलोकन, आधुनिक विज्ञान से सावधान तुलना और अंततः एक ऐसी परिकल्पना जिसे भविष्य में वैज्ञानिक विधियों द्वारा जांचा जा सके। विज्ञान हमें यह समझने में सहायता करती है या करता है कि कोई प्रक्रिया कैसे घटित होती है। साहित्य हमें यह समझने में सहायता करता है कि वह अनुभव मनुष्य के लिए क्या अर्थ रखता है। चिकित्सा को दोनों की आवश्यकता है, प्रमाण की भी और करुणापूर्ण मानवीय समझ की भी। भविष्य में इस कार्य को आगे बढ़ाने के लिए संस्कृत विद्वानों, महाभारत के विशेषज्ञों, इतिहासकारों, चिकित्सकों, तंत्रिका विज्ञानियों, मनोवैज्ञानिकों, जरा विज्ञान और प्रशासमक चिकित्सा के विशेषज्ञों, नीति शास्त्रियों तथा चिकित्सा शिक्षकों के बीच वास्तविक सहयोग आवश्यक होगा। हम मिलकर यह जान सकते हैं कि शिक्षा, प्रतिज्ञा, पहचान, संज्ञानात्मक दृढ़ता और गंभीर विकलांगता के बाद व्यक्तित्व जीवन के अंतिम चरण में गरिमा और आध्यात्मिक अर्थ जैसे विषयों को आधुनिक अनुसंधान में किस प्रकार जिम्मेदारी पूर्वक रूपांतरित किया जा सकता है। आज का यह व्याख्यान किसी अंतिम निष्कर्ष की घोषणा नहीं है, यह एक संवाद का आरंभ और सहयोग का निमंत्रण है। यदि इस प्रयास से संस्कृत के किसी मूल पाठ को अधिक सावधानी से पढ़ा जाए, चिकित्सा का कोई नया प्रश्न उत्पन्न हो अथवा किसी गंभीर रूप से अस्वस्थ व्यक्ति को उसकी शारीरिक अक्षमता से परे एक संपूर्ण मनुष्य के रूप में देखा जाए, तो मैं इस प्रयास को सार्थक समझूंगा। अन्ते अहम एतदेव निवेदयितुम इच्छामि यत भीष्मस्य जीवन वृत्तान्तः केवलं महाभारतस्य कस्यचित् महापुरुषस्य कथा नास्ति। तत्र शिक्षणं, गुरुपदेशः, प्रतिज्ञा, कर्तव्यनिष्ठा, नेतृत्वं, धर्मसंकटः, घोरः शारीरिकाघातः, वेदना, ज्ञानदानम्, आध्यात्मिकता, गरिमा तथा मृत्योः सचेतना स्वीकृतिः एते सर्वे एकस्मिन् दीर्घ जीवन वृत्तान्ते दृश्यन्ते। अस्मिन् व्याख्याने भीष्मस्य जीवनं 3 अवस्थासु विचारितं: निर्माणं, प्रतिबद्धता, परिपूर्णता च। निर्माणावस्था अस्मान् शिक्षायाः, गुरु शिष्य संबंधस्य, अभ्यासस्य, स्मृतेः, बहुविषयक ज्ञानस्य तथा नेतृत्व विकासस्य विषये चिन्तितुं प्रेरयति। प्रतिबद्धतायाः अवस्था दर्शयति यत् सार्वजनिक प्रतिज्ञा मनुष्यस्य व्यक्तित्वाय स्थैर्य, प्रयोजनं, दृढ़तां च दातुं शक्नोति, किन्तु सा एव प्रतिज्ञा परिवर्तितासु परिस्थितिषु अनुकूलन शक्तिं सीमितमपि कर्तुं शक्नोति। परिपूर्णतया अवस्था दर्शति यत् घोर शारीरिक अपराधीनतायामपि संवादः, निर्णय शक्तिः, ज्ञानं, सामाजिक योगदानम्, आध्यात्मिक कार्यः, मानवीय गरिमा च अविष्टाः भवितुं शक्नुवन्ति। परन्तु महाभारतम् आधुनिकस्य तंत्रिका विज्ञानस्य, चिकित्सा विज्ञानस्य या ग्रन्थः इति प्रतिपादनम् अस्य प्रयासस्य उद्देश्यं नास्ति। अस्य प्रयासस्य उद्देश्यं नास्ति। साहित्यं वैज्ञानिक प्रमाणस्य स्थानं न गृह्णाति। आधुनिक वैज्ञानिक संकल्पना प्राचीन संस्कृत पदेषु बलात् आरोपणीयाः न सन्ति। अतः अत्र एकः अनुशासितः मार्गः प्रस्तावितः। प्रथमं मूल संस्कृत पाठः, ततः भाषाशास्त्रीयम् ऐतिहासिकं च परीक्षणम्, अनन्तरं निष्पक्षं मानवीयवलोकनम्, आधुनिक विज्ञानेन सावधानीपूर्वकं तुलनात्मक चिन्तनम्, अन्ते च परीक्षण योग्या परिकल्पना। विज्ञानं कथयति काचित् प्रक्रिया कथं भवति, साहित्यं पृच्छति सा प्रक्रिया मनुष्यस्य जीवने किम् अर्थं धारयति। चिकित्सा विज्ञानाय उभयो आवश्यकता अस्ति, प्रमाणस्य अपि करुणायुक्त मानवीय बोधस्य अपि। अस्य कार्यस्य भावि विकासाय संस्कृत विदुषाम्, इतिहासविदां, चिकित्सकानां, तंत्रिका विज्ञानानां, मनोवैज्ञानिकानां, जरा विज्ञान विशेषज्ञानां, प्रशामक चिकित्साविदों, नीति शास्त्रज्ञानां, चिकित्सा शिक्षणां च सहयोगः अपेक्षितः अस्ति। परस्परं सहकार्यं कृत्वा वयं शिक्षायाः, प्रतिज्ञायाः, व्यक्तित्वस्य संज्ञानात्मक दृढतायाः, विकलांगतायामपि व्यक्तित्वस्य, अन्त्यजीवनस्य गरिमायाः, आध्यात्मिक कारिथस्य च विषये नवीनान् परीक्षणायोग्यान् प्रश्नान् निर्मातुं शक्नुमः। In the closing, the life of Bhīṣma offers us more than the story of a remarkable figure in the Mahābhārata. It presents an entire human life, from education and the formation of expertise to commitment and institutional responsibility, and from moral conflict and catastrophic bodily injury to teaching, dignity, spiritual meaning, and consciously oriented death. In this lecture, I have examined the life through three phases: formation, commitment, and fulfillment. Formation directs our attention to education, mentorship, multidisciplinary learning, memory, practice, and the development of judgment. Commitment reveals how a public vow can give identity, extraordinary coherence, purpose, and endurance, while also limiting flexibility when circumstances change. Fulfillment shows us that severe physical dependence need not extinguish communication, agency, wisdom, spiritual meaning, social contribution, or human dignity. The purpose of this inquiry, however, is not to claim that Mahābhārata is a textbook of modern neuroscience or medicine. Literature is not biomedical evidence, and contemporary scientific concepts should not be imposed retrospectively upon Sanskrit categories. What I have proposed is a disciplined pathway, beginning with primary Sanskrit text, proceeding through philological and historical interpretation, identifying a neutral human observation, comparing it cautiously with contemporary scholarship, and finally formulating a hypothesis that can be tested and, if necessary, rejected. Science helps us investigate how a process occurs. Literature helps us understand what that experience means within a human life. Medicine needs both. It requires evidence to determine what works, but it also requires narrative understanding to recognize what matters. The future of this work, therefore, depends upon the genuine collaboration among Sanskrit scholars, historians, clinicians, neuroscientists, psychologists, gerontologists, palliative care specialists, ethicists, and medical educators. Together, we may develop responsible research questions concerning education and expertise, identity and commitment, cognitive resilience, personhood after catastrophic disability, dignity near the end of life, and the place of spiritual meaning within care. My work, this lecture, is not intended as the final word. It is the beginning of a conversation, a proposal for a research program, and an invitation to collaborate. Adyatanam Vyakhanam na antam nirnayah apitu संवादस्य आरंभः अनुसंधानस्य प्रस्तावः सहयोगस्य च सादरं निमंत्रणम् अस्ति. यह जो व्याख्यान है किसी अंतिम निष्कर्ष की घोषणा नहीं है, यह एक संवाद का आरंभ और सहयोग का निमंत्रण है. यदि इस प्रयास से संस्कृत के किसी मूल पाठ को अधिक सावधानी से पढ़ा जाए, चिकित्सा का कोई नया प्रश्न उत्पन्न हो अथवा किसी गंभीर रूप से अस्वस्थ व्यक्ति को किसी शारीरिक अक्षमता से परे एक संपूर्ण मनुष्य के रूप में देखा जाए, तो मैं इस प्रयास को सार्थक मानूंगा। और इसी भावना के साथ अपनी बात समाप्त करता हूं। आप सभी को बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। थैंक यू सो मच। विद दिस आई कंक्लूड। नमो नमः। हरि ओम।